Me know, because I know I at times speak too quickly for those whose first language is not English. I didn't know how to start this, so I'm going to try and think about some of the issues that I've thought about over the last 30 years in relation to agriculture and ethics, and see where we go. The European Patent Office produced a document some time ago now called Scenarios for the Future. And one of the paragraphs talked about the fact that at the beginning of the 21st century, patenting activity has moved from industrial knowledge closer to basic knowledge, and many new fields have become patentable. This has led to expressions of public concern that things are now being patented that should be excluded. Here, there's a lot of people around the world who believe that plants should never be patentable. But let's think about that for a moment and see where we are and where we've stood. The American Constitution is one of the first English language documents which really talks about patenting. The Statute of Anne in the UK talked about copyright. The Congress shall have power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for a limited time, and that's important, to authors and inventors the exclusive right to the respective writings and discoveries. And again, the word discoveries is quite interesting. The first Patent Act in the United States of 1793 defined statutory subject matter as any new and useful art, machine, manufacture or composition of matter, or any new or useful improvement thereof. The first organism to be patented in the United States in particular was that of a bacterium by Adnan Chakrabarty, and it was a real fight between the then USPTO Commissioner, Diamond, it's a nice name, and Adnan Chakrabarty, but his first name's, Adnan. He argued, it was decided in 1980 that he could patent his microorganism. And the Chief Justice at the time said anything under the sun that is made by man can be patented, except changes to the humans, because of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which refers to the concept of slavery. So we've got something really interesting, the right to patent anything. It's not only the United States. Many people argue that changing plants using modern biotechnological techniques is playing God, and we should not play God, or should we? They suggest no one should own a patent on Mother Nature. They further suggest there should never be patents on seeds. Greenpeace has led this particular movement. The organization calling itself Stop Patents on Plants and Animals talks about many of these issues in lurid terms, trying to convince the public that patents on nature are unacceptable. The one I really enjoyed was, of course, one organization that suggested that we should not have a patent on beer. Trademark here, patent, no. But the first patent, in reality, on a microorganism was not Chakrabarty's. It was actually Pasteur in 1873 who patented the manufacture of, let's call it, clean beer. So what are the issues? Why do people say no patents on plants? Some argue differently. Paragraph 26 of the first chapter of the book of Genesis in the King James Version, and it's not the same as the Hebrew version, I should tell you, talks about a concept of dominion over the creepy crawlies, including, it would imply, plants, although it doesn't mention. What does the word dominion mean? Usually we talk about the rights of a sovereign state in relation to its citizens, and dominion in this instance means responsibility to and for, not just the right to do what you like. So responsibility is built into the concept of the English word dominion. Furthermore, we've always modified plants. None of the food plants that we use today look actually very much like the plant from which they came originally, as you know. I've got a couple of examples: teosinte and maize. We usually hear the argument that teosinte is the precursor of maize, and humans have turned one into the other by crossbreeding, traditional breeding. I could talk about wheat, where we now use dwarf varieties of wheat because they don't get knocked over by the rain, it's like the one we've had today. That made actually the Green Revolution and made it important. So let's accept, I think we're forced to accept, and many may not like me for that, but you will, that plants have been modified and are being modified by humans all the time for the purposes of creating food. And food to feed us is possibly an ethical statement. It remains true that a very large proportion of the world's people don't get enough to eat. And it's at least argued that once Brexit happens, the Brits won't have enough to eat. At the end of the 20th century, we had a number of environmental documents produced through the United Nations. One was called Agenda 21, which did not refer to the 21st agenda, but rather to the 21st century. The major thrust of food security, they said, is to bring about a significant increase in agricultural production in a sustainable way to achieve a substantial improvement in people's entitlement to adequate food and culturally appropriate food supplies. And that in itself is an important concept. You don't bring yellow maize into Kenya because animals are fed yellow maize, people eat white maize in Kenya. So by sending yellow maize to Kenya, you might be implying that the people there are animals in their minds. So you have to be aware of that sort of issue. In Agenda 21 as well, they said, biotechnology cannot resolve all the fundamental problems of environment and development. So we need to be realistic. But the new technologies are available to us to enable our better use of land of water and of food production. And both of those, all three of those, are important, and we mustn't forget water, particularly in this city. Earlier this afternoon, comments were made about the concept of sovereignty, the right of a nation state to assume control over that which exists within its borders. Actually, it's fascinating that although the United States signed the Convention on Biological Diversity, it is not a member. Actually, the United States and the Vatican are the only two places in the world, as far as I know, which are not members of the Convention on Biological Diversity. In the case of the Vatican, they don't have any diversity, biological diversity. In the case of the United States, we have to ask why they didn't join. And many argue that it was this concept of sovereignty that was the reason for their choosing not to join. Is it important to assert sovereignty? In the 1860s, Brazil had the monopoly on rubber, and Manaus, sitting on the confluence, I think, of the Rio Grande and the Amazon, was the center of the rubber trade and has the most magnificent opera house built because of that. They banned the export of rubber plants. But Kew Gardens had some rubber plants, and they sent them to Malaya. And Brazil lost its control of rubber to the extent that Manaus became an island not doing very much, actually, between the two rivers. So sovereignty was already there, and they were trying already before 1992 to modify the rights to indigenous plants in their country. But nobody accepted that right. Now we are pushing for that through the CBD itself. What about the World Trade Organization? Again, some of my colleagues in Britain would find that interesting. But again, the WTO is talking about the needs to assure ourselves of sustainable development, of proper, effective use of agriculture to feed people and to provide that which people think they need. It's more than just sustainability, sustaining life, it's much more. So where does ethics come into that? Well, the primary thing that we think about is that humans are the subject of our work, that we're trying desperately to provide a world for humans and for the children of currently living people. The argument in many of the ethics papers that I have had the opportunity to read is that we should leave the world in at least as good a state as we got it from our parents. At least. We're not doing it, but that's another matter. When we negotiated the Cartagena Protocol, which is an addendum, if you like, to the Convention on Biological Diversity, they talked about, in a decision of the Conference of the Parties, that we need to recognize that modern biotechnology has great potential for human well-being if developed and used with adequate safety measures for both the environment and for human health. Important. Because Europe in particular has said, we don't want it. We don't need it. We're going along all right. So Austria and France and Italy and Greece and Norway, not a member of the EU, have said no products of biotechnology which have been grown in fields. It's okay if they were produced in laboratories or in factories, like vitamin C, but if they grow in fields, we won't have it. Now that's very, very significant. Fine for most of Europe, where most people like me, when I'm in Europe, live a life which is comfortable. We have most things that we need. But if you're denying the right to modify plants so we can get better plants in better conditions, in better condition, how does that impact on the countries in Africa who either have to export food to Europe, and they're not allowed to, or they say, if Europeans think they're not safe, why should we grow them? So there is an ethical issue, even in the denying of the use of this new technology in Europe, because it impacts other people who are not getting enough to eat. And that, to me, is a major issue. And so we come to the legal position in Europe, which has been ignored basically by most European countries because they've ignored the scientific evidence and they've ignored the decisions of the European Food Standards Authority, EFSA, which say most of the products of biotechnology are safe, and they've said, no, we don't want them. This particular directive that I've got on the screen is actually the patent directive, which permits the patenting. It's Article 3. Thank you. Which permits the patenting of biological materials produced using new technologies. It says that inventions which are new, which involve an inventive step, and which are susceptible of industrial application, so the three conditions, standard conditions for patents, shall be patentable even if they concern a product consisting of or containing biological material, or a process by means of which biological material is produced, processed, or used. So biological patents are allowed. That's a simple explanation of what that says. Biological material which is isolated from its natural environment or produced by means of a technical process may be the subject of an invention even if it previously occurred in nature. Okay, so the best example is insulin. Isolated from a human, could be patented. We'd already done it, but this makes it clear that even though the insulin that you produce in the laboratory is identical as a product to that which is produced within the human body, that which is produced in the factory is patentable. There's many discussions on this for obvious reasons. The one I thought I had on the screen but didn't was the Directive 2001-18, which refers to the release into the environment of genetically modified organisms or of their marketing. And it defines an organism as any biological entity capable of replication or of transferring genetic material, and that which is genetically modified is the material, is the organism where the genetic material has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally. Important. If it could occur naturally, it's not a GMO, by that definition. So if there was a mutation, if there could be a mutation which results in the same product, it's not a GMO. Now that's very interesting because the two are very far apart from one another. So if you could produce it by simple natural mutation, even though you didn't, it's not a GMO, as the law stands. Fascinating. And that becomes really important given the decision of the ECJ a few months ago in relation to mutation. And I'll address that again slightly a little later, if I may. The concern really of the green groups is not the GMO itself. It's not the new technologies, whether it's GMO or otherwise. It's the concept of the industrialization of agriculture and the small number of major companies that are involved in producing seed for use. It's argued that the industrialization of agriculture takes away the traditional structures of society and substitutes a different system that may cause harm. The French talk about the concept of terroir, that you only grow Pinot Noir in the Burgundy area, and that's the only place that can make good wine. South Africa would argue. This industrialization may arguably help in providing more and better food at the cost of disrupting traditional belief systems and modifying the way of life of many in rural areas that may result in less food available where and when necessary, especially with the problem of transport and urbanization around the world. So we have to think about those issues. In 2008, the group which, following it, I chaired, produced a report on the ethics of modern development in agricultural technologies. The world has moved on since we produced that report by a very long way. But for those interested in this topic, it's on the web, and typical of the European Union, the internet address to get hold of that must be the most convoluted that I've ever come across. It's on the slide. That's one line. But really, I believe it's worth reading. One of the issues that we addressed in that report was that instead of trying to do a risk assessment of the impact of modern technology on agriculture, we should do an impact assessment which looks at the benefits, the risks, and the benefits and risks of not using that new technology as well. And we don't do that. I talked a little bit about undernourished people around the world, and this just gives you a feeling for that. You will notice that it's primarily Africa where people are starving. Some of it in South America, and some of it in China and India, the Philippines, Indonesia. None of it, apparently, according to this map, in Antarctica. But that's because there aren't any people. Important because we started off with the concept that we have to be able to feed people. We looked in that report at a concept of GDP per capita against percentage of people involved in agriculture. And you see that the bigger the GDP per capita, the fewer people are involved in agriculture. Europe, 3%. India, 50%. Simple as that. So we recommended, as a group, that we need to promote innovation in agriculture as much as possible. And we did say we were concerned about the impact of patents on agricultural crops. The move to control use of seed by means of license agreements was also considered to be a problem. It asked the EU to carry out an analysis of the shifting of plant variety protection from CIOPORA to a patent system, and whether it produces a system that effectively stifles innovation if we did that. I.e., we preferred CIOPORA over a patent system for plants. But that, I'm sure, doesn't surprise this room. We also asked for examination of the European and international mechanisms on fair competition by private companies in the agricultural product sector to ensure that the impact of agreements on the sharing of patents and vertical control is properly addressed. And again, I'll return to that in a few moments if I may. We were aware, this is not totally true, but we were aware then, and it's less important now, that patents are associated primarily with new technologies, and that take-up may therefore be hindered by the high cost of the new technology products, particularly in developing countries. We need to take account, we said, even though we were working for Europe, in the impact of patented seed and agriculture for developing countries. And we also talked about the concept of patent pools to ensure availability to farmers, particularly in developing countries. To give a feel, the global area of biotech crops is shown here. The total industrial countries are blue, developing countries are in yellow, but it's still quite small in developing countries. The global area of biotech crops was roughly 200 million hectares, but very few crops, very few plants have been involved. In the US, maize and soybean constitute the vast majority of genetically modified crops, with cotton and some others there as well. In South Africa, it's basically three products: maize, corn for those who need it, soybean, and cotton. And this was in 2017. So we've got a number of problems that we sort of identified. The first was multi-trait issues. And looking at it, what does the farmer want? The farmer wants those traits in the crop that they want to plant, which will benefit the environment and his commercial output as much as possible. The farmer arguably may not want to say, I only want to buy my crop from Monsanto. They can't anyway. They'd have to buy it from Bayer. But they don't want to say that. They say, I want a trait which gives me drought tolerance in the Eastern Cape here. And also, I want an insecticide inside my plant because I'm getting real problems with insect depredation. I want both. But Syngenta owns the patent to one, and Bayer owns the patent to the other. How do I get both? I suppose I could plant one seed of one and one seed of the other, and some of them will survive, but that won't help me. Second generation might. But how do we handle that? Impasse.